Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by a friend of the Carnegie Council and a face you might recognize if you've been watching Ethics Matter because he is a former host of this program, James Traub. James, it's so nice to have you here. Obviously, I'm not going to go through your entire resume because it is exceedingly rich with writings on foreign policy, on history, on the major moral dilemmas facing us today. Including the refugee crisis and the rise of far-right movements around the globe. You can read James's provocative reports, by the way, in Foreign Policy magazine and on fp.com. James, I want to focus on the refugee crisis because starting in the summer of 2015, I remember almost blanket coverage on cable networks of the migrant crisis, people drowning, chaos on the borders of European countries. What is your sense of where we are today in 2017?
Well, first of all, Stephanie, thank you. I'm delighted to be here at Carnegie. And it's true, this is a subject I've spent a lot of time writing about and thinking about. So let me try to describe what I think is not so much a crisis as a sequence of crises, because we're not in the same one now that we were in, as you say, in the summer of 2015. So the first crisis, chronologically, but also in terms of moral importance, was the terrible humanitarian crisis of 1 million people desperately fleeing warfare from Syria, from Iraq, then later from Afghanistan and elsewhere. But because they all fled at once, or at least very quickly in a way that was unprecedented, and therefore essentially surpassed all of the legal and physical barriers that normally are meant to control immigration and refugees, they presented themselves almost at once on the borders of Europe and at the borders of European countries. That created a second crisis, which I think of as a crisis of sovereignty, that people throughout Europe, yes, chiefly people whose orientation maybe was more nationalistic, but not only, had a deep, deep fear of their country's borders, their sovereignty being violated. And that led to a real reaction and ultimately led Europe to act collectively to stanch the flow of immigrants in March of 2016 when the EU reached a deal with Turkey, which essentially turned Turkey into a kind of giant sink, to use a not very nice metaphor, for the refugees, who have remained there since then.
We are feeling like that we are in a jail. We are treated like the criminals, and we have no information that what is going on and what they will do with us.
And I just want to pause here to just remind the viewer that Turkey is not a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugee Rights. So right. A refugee in Turkey may be treated differently than a refugee in Europe.
That is absolutely true, and is one of the reasons why many people thought it was a cynical deal. I think it was a very painful deal to have to make, but it's not easy to see what the alternatives were at the time. Okay, so that's solved, in a way, the second thing, the sovereignty crisis. Now we are in a phase of an assimilation crisis. That is to say, Europe is now seeking to integrate. It'll be less than 1 million probably in the end. Let's say it's 750,000, an enormous number of people who are, by and large, Muslim, in a place that is, of course, chiefly Christian, who are pious, in a place that is chiefly secular, and who, on average, are poorly educated in a place where the economy depends increasingly on high education and high skills. So this is an intrinsic problem of colossal proportions.
You lay out really well, I think, all of the broad topics that I want to delve in further. Let's just take them apart a little bit, starting with assimilation in an article that you wrote in 2015 about Sweden, that basically, well, it was, first of all, it was titled "The Death of the Most Generous Nation."
I didn't write the title, though I have to say,
you did not write the headline.
It did make people read it, that's for sure.
It's a dramatic headline. But really what you did is, well, you did write this. Quote, "This is a story of the exorbitant and ultimately intolerable cost that Sweden has paid for its unshared idealism." And just to bring the viewer up to speed, this was an article that really, broke a lot of the stereotypes we had as Sweden as being this blindly welcoming country where everyone was assimilating. And in fact, what you did was highlight some of the difficulties in assimilation. What did you see there that convinced you that this could really be a major problem for Sweden?
Well, Stephanie, by a coincidence, which for a journalist was a wonderful coincidence, I happened to be in Sweden in November of 2015 at the moment when the Interior Ministry announced we've run out of space. We've literally run out of space. So what was happening was refugees were reaching Sweden, of course, from the south, chiefly from Denmark. And Sweden, being a very wealthy, a very generous, and a very well-organized country, had a system in place for registering refugees and then sending them all over the country. But there was not a lot of spare housing. And so local entrepreneurs would lease an unused stadium or a hospital, anything, and say, okay, I've got 100 beds. And they would send them there. I was there the day they ran out of beds. And the minister went on television and, well, two things happened. One is they said, we can't take any more people, we're going to turn them back to Denmark, which was shocking, but they physically couldn't take any more people. And then several days later, when the government had a chance to think about this, the prime minister and basically the minister in charge of refugees, who was a member of the Green Party, went on television, they did a press conference, a televised press conference, to say that Sweden was going to have to change its open arms refugee policy, though it wasn't quite clear how that would be. The Green minister broke down in tears. That moment exemplified this irresolvable tension between a profound moral commitment, which really is just deeply admirable, and an intransigent reality, which had just overcome that barrier.
The reality you're talking about now is the literal capacity for Sweden, but that article touched on much more than the literal capacity of a society to absorb these immigrants, right, either with infrastructure and housing, right, but with education, with public health, with right, all of those issues, which is an issue and a reality. The other reality you delve into in your writing in Sweden and also later in Germany and in Dresden is that there are ideological differences. Is that what you would call them? Cultural differences between some of the migrants and refugees that were accepted into Sweden, that some of them had an easier time versus others right, in integrating. Right. Can you talk about that aspect of your reporting?
So this is one of those sensitive topics that people aren't comfortable talking about. Sweden has had, in general, a very good experience with refugees. Sweden opened itself up to political refugees from all sorts of totalitarian societies, whether they were from Chile, whether they were from Iran. In the 90s, they accepted lots of Bosnians, lots of Kurds. So some of these people were Muslims, some were not. In general, they integrated very well into Swedish society. Well, these were largely middle-class, well-educated people. People who are fleeing political repression are very often people who are political activists and therefore well-educated professional people. And Sweden felt justly proud of the fact that my pediatrician is a Bosnian, my neighbor is a Kurd, and so we can do this.
Right.
Then they began taking refugees from places which were just more impoverished and people were less educated, Eritreans and Somalis. Now it becomes more complicated. And so there I met, while in Sweden, a number of economists who said to me, look, if you compare the labor force penetration rate and the time it takes to get into the labor force of the former immigrants who are more or less at the level of ordinary Swedes, and these guys, it's radically different. Maybe half of them aren't in the labor force. It takes them 7 years. It's harder for them to learn Swedish. There is, if you talk to people, you will hear, we now have inner city slums. Now, anyone who lives in the United States and sees the inner city slums of Malmo will say, that's not a slum. It's just kind of substandard housing. But for them, it's different. There are areas, there are pockets of high unemployment, relatively high crime, and so on. So already there was this anxiety. Then you have this new flood of people, and this is far larger numbers than in the past. Sweden has taken annually 70 or 80,000 people, which is incredible for a country of 9.5 million.
More per capita than any other European country.
And so when the refugee crisis happened, they took 160,000 people. Again, for a country of 9.5 million, that is significantly more than Germany took per capita, Germany being a country almost 10 times bigger. And then the question was, if we already are beginning to experience these problems, how is this going to be good for us?
And this is something that you found in your reporting recently in Germany. Were also challenges that migrants and local citizens were facing, these potential tensions?
So I went to Dresden, which I also will be returning to, because obviously Germany is the big story here. And the Germans, like the Swedes, have had but even more, how shall I say, German, a very coherent system for distributing refugees according to an algorithm that has to do with the population of the place they're going to, its level of wealth, and I don't know what else. So, some of the major cities of West Germany, Munich, Frankfurt, and so on, will receive large numbers of refugees. The major cities in the east, slightly smaller numbers. Well, I decided to go to Dresden because a place like Munich, where I did spend time, is one of the wealthiest places in the world, and certainly in Europe. And they have extraordinary capacity to not only spend the kind of money, but have the kind of institutions, including voluntary ones, that can really help absorb people. I thought better to do the experiment in the East, where also people are more conservative. And the sense of German nationalism is stronger, and the sense of having a universal as opposed to national obligation is weaker. So, Dresden. Dresden also happens to be the birthplace of a xenophobic, skinhead-oriented movement called Pegida, which has now spread elsewhere in Europe, explicitly anti-refugee movement. So I thought, good place to see how this assimilation thing works, plus the political consequences. So, my sense in going to Dresden was, first, it's very hard to easily characterize the average level of readiness to integrate of this vast population of people. Because I met remarkable people who, the moment they landed, they thought, how am I going to do work? How am I going to change myself? How am I going to fit into this world? But you meet a lot of people who have been deeply scarred by the experience of getting there. I mean, these are not people who just picked up and got in a bus and came to Germany. As we all know, this was an epic and terrifying journey, and people were really, really, really scarred by it. In addition to that, a lot of them are not well educated. I would guess that among the Syrians I met, the average level of education was about 9th grade or so. And in Germany, everybody graduates from high school, and those who don't go on to university have had a very, very extensive vocational education. All Muslim, often very conservative. The wives tend not to work, so very problematic. I met a fair number of Afghan youth who were being cared for under really admirably, with a lot of attention. But these are kids, again, who had about a 4th or 5th grade education. So Germany is making a big effort to integrate them in terms of education, job training, and so forth. But it's going to be very hard. And my sense is, when I meet a family of, let's say, parents and teenagers, I think the parents probably are a lost cause. They are going to be a charge to the state. Germany has to accept that. And the big question will be, what about the teenagers? Which way are they going to go? Are they going to become a new alienated underclass, such as the French and the Belgians have to deal with? Will they integrate? What will be the balance between them? We don't know the answers, but of course, the right in Germany feels like we know the answer. This is going to be bad for us.
I want to delve a little bit into the controversial part that you noted was controversial, which is the ideological differences, and particularly with women's rights. There are many migrants that come from cultures where women's rights may not exist at all. Is it too optimistic to believe that once they find themselves in Munich or in Malmo, that they will learn to fit into society? I mean, this is sort of a philosophical question, right? There, like you said, there are those that will come and will embrace the ideals of a pluralistic, progressive society in which women have the choice to work, and there are those that won't. Why does it matter that there are those that won't?
Well, okay, let me take those in reverse order then. Why it matters, obviously, that's a profound issue. It matters because a society is not just a collection of people, it's a collection of values, a collection of sets of behavior. And for it to be a coherent society, there has to be a kind of fundamental agreement on what it is to be a German, an American, whatever it is. And the historical experience is that immigrants seek to assimilate in regard to those values. They may want to keep their folk ways, but they seek to become parts of those societies. And obviously, that differs enormously from country to country. The United States being at the very far end of everybody becomes American. Here, though, we encounter the real question of religion. Because if integration means I'm going to surrender my most deeply held values, well, then no, that integration means annihilating who I am. And for most people who are coming here now as refugees, who are not highly educated, prosperous people who tend to have already been secularized, they tend to be already more pious. And then there is this new phenomenon that the next generation, the younger generation, often becomes more conservative, not less so. That is, the way they rebel against their parents is by becoming highly theological, by adopting Salafism, which is a very fundamentalist form of Islam. And so, whereas the pattern in the past has been each generation becomes more like the nation you've assimilated into than the previous one, now you have young people in Holland, France, Belgium, and elsewhere who are perfectly French-speaking, Dutch-speaking, and so on, but in their values actually turn back to a form of conservative Islam that their parents themselves don't practice. So that is a real source of worry. And if you look at polls of the Islamic community in Europe, which includes people of whatever generation, their views on questions of law, value, and religion are radically different from those of the surrounding people. For example, you ask people, is homosexuality acceptable?
Right.
The difference between the numbers you would get from non-immigrant Europeans and Islamic immigrant Europeans is radical. Right. The fraction of people who profess Islam in England who say homosexuality is acceptable is zero.
Right.
Zero. That's worrisome. Then, though, you have to ask, if you are worried that recognizing painful truths will make it impossible to make hard decisions because it will so prejudice people, well, then you have a problem in democracy. I mean, it's a little bit like talking about global warming, which is to say, but this is from a different point of view, if we tell the truth about global warming, it's going to make people really upset because it's hard and they don't want to do it, and so they'll turn against it, which indeed seems to be what's happened. Well, if that is true, then we have a real problem with democracy in itself.
Which I think we do, and which I should mention that James is actually working on a book right now about, shall I describe it as the fall of liberalism?
The rise and fall.
The rise
and fall of liberalism.
This is the conversation that we've been having a lot here on this stage, which is the polarization of issues that's not just a result of the far right, but also the far left. So you describe this as the opinion corridor, which I understand is actually a Swedish word. Can you explain to the viewer what the opinion corridor is?
Yeah, well, it's a word for political correctness, and Donald Trump's favorite term. I guess I would say just because Donald Trump uses it doesn't mean it's completely specious. And so in Sweden, far more than in the United States, there is a deep sense of one does not talk about unpleasant things because they might lead you to do unpleasant things, exactly as the premise of your question was. And so I learned this expression from someone who is a relatively rare centrist in the Swedish debate, who says, we have an obligation to take all these people. I am proud as a Swede that we took all these people. But we have to be honest about the enormous difficulty that will come in integrating these people. And we can't just say, isn't it great that Sweden is a cosmopolitan society? Isn't it great that Sweden is an open society and that we honor our moral commitments? No. If that's all we say, we are not going to prepare ourselves for this difficulty. For example, she said, so long as Sweden offers social benefits to newcomers much greater than those of the surrounding country, it will be a magnet. And we want to be welcoming, but we don't want to be a magnet. Therefore, we have to find a way of adjusting the benefits we offer so that everybody doesn't say, let's go to Sweden. People should be distributed among different European countries. So she said to me, these questions are things nobody wants to talk about. And then she told me that we have this word in Swedish, åsiktskorridor, which she said translates as opinion corridor, which is that narrow place that it is okay to go down, and if you step outside of it, then you are being un-Swedish. You're being ungenerous,
You're being
unidealistic.
unpolitically correct.
You're being politically incorrect.
Is it also counterproductive when it comes to policy to not, I mean, I guess you allude to this, to not be acknowledging some of the data on jobs that your professor in Sweden,
of course you have
who
to.
wouldn't give you his name,
who wouldn't give me his name
because he was so worried about
right.
sounding politically incorrect.
No, he sounds politically incorrect for a living. He was worried about people, coming out, knocking on his door and telling him that he was a monster. How can we have an honest policy discussion? I mean, let's think about an analogy in this country. For a long time, there were a lot of things about welfare that it was considered unacceptable to say. And Bill Clinton, to his great credit, said a lot of them. And he said, we have to change the welfare system because there is such a thing as welfare dependency. And the problems of the underclass are not wholly caused by racism, structural and otherwise, but also caused by behavior that's being reinforced by our welfare system.
Which to a lot of Democrats was
sacrilegious
anathema. To say. Yes.
It was and it was racist.
Right.
It was racist. Well, that's why it's really hard to say that stuff, but it is true. And so the more the Democrats couldn't say that, the more they backed themselves into a corner, which was all too easy for Republicans to exploit because they couldn't bring themselves to say things that a lot of people believed to be so. And so Clinton actually kind of lanced that boil by speaking that painful truth. And so we need to separate the need to recognize, honestly, hard problems from the wish for simplistic and cruel answers. So it is simply not the case that being honest about hard things causes Donald Trump. If anything, I would say refusing to talk about those hard things leaves the field open to the populist demagogue like Donald Trump.
What are the ultimate, and I'll let this be sort of your final thought. Again, you are writing a book about the fall of liberalism and all of the great things that those of us that have enjoyed liberalism have enjoyed. Not living in a totalitarian society, living in a place where we have those inalienable rights is the ultimate outcome of the liberals not getting it and thereby empowering in some ways the right, the fall of these values that I assume you and I both hold and cherish dear?
Here's the hope. The hope is that by applying a certain kind of liberal medicine, which is to say economic reform, we can begin to lower that fever. For example, one hopes that it is true that, well, no, let's say, I believe that it is true, that extreme inequality produced by the nature of capitalism but also by a very ideological view that it is only the marketplace that matters, has had incredibly destructive effects, culturally as well as economically, and that we have to address that. And so I would like to think that that classically liberal solution would be what helps save these values that we believe in. But these questions of globalization, of the other, of loss of identity, I don't think they're all going to be solved by economics. And I don't have very good answers to the question of how you speak to people's profound sense of loss. But a politics that only thinks in terms of economics and thinks values, they're just a dependent variable of economics, and people's values, they'll stop having bad values when they're doing better, I think that's naive.
James Traub, such an important perspective to have. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.